Hey, folks, how are you? And the topic that I end up delving into ends up finding me at times basically talking out of both sides of my mouth. Why do I say that? Because in several leagues, I shouldn't just say one, in several leagues that I cover, there is a need for investment. There is a need for money to be pumped in to make a better product both on the pitch and off of it as well. It ends up being important for the overall production to be able to improve. I'm talking, like I said, both in and off the pitch. Where I find myself in disagreement is that a lot of times when people talk about privatization in terms of football, it ends up being more plundering than it ends up being more a football related topic where individuals go in and in their best interest, which sometimes ends up being almost an oxymoron in certain regions. Football ends up being the last thing people think about. For every positive example that I've heard from a European perspective, I can give you 25 that aren't. Talk to fans of Colo Colo in Chile and talk about the privatization that they went through. The fans at Racing and the privatization that they've gone through. The people at Montevideo City Torque and the privatization that they've gone through. A team that was looked at as a great experiment in Uruguayan football, but then ended up being run into the ground and eventually ends up being relegated. You look at teams like Corinthians, who in name really aren't that, but they are handled mostly by investors. Brazilian football has become more of an investor's game than it is about the clubs themselves. And that's where you have this battle going on between progress and business and football at its most identifiable level. Again, these two always end up having that collision at some point, at some time, and depending on which characters you end up putting in that particular novel. When many have talked about the implementation or the actual implementation of privatization in Argentine football, look, on paper it sounds like a great idea. It is a great idea. Hey, look, I've said it before. Argentina, Argentine football need investment for the reasons I mentioned earlier on. But, and I've said this as well, keep in mind the structures that are in place at the club level in a lot of situations. I'll give you the example of River Plate. River Plate, one of the biggest clubs, not only in Argentina, but in all of the world in terms of amounts of members. It's not just football. They have different sports. They have different disciplines. They even have a school for children to go to. And if any of that structure ends up being changed or moved, which is one of the criticisms that is being held in this current administration at River, where the priority ends up being the branding instead of the structurization of several things, although the stadium is brand new and many have hailed it. One thing is the structurization, another thing is the identity that is lost, but that's another topic for another time. And many see that identity being lost. And in a context of privatization, what ends up occurring is that school that many children grew up learning about life, about sport, about their ABCs and their 1, 2, 3s and their math and all these other things that you end up learning while you're in school. It's the identification of that to River that ends up making it so important in such a deep bond where families go to enjoy time with their family, with their friends, and you create bonds within the club and the identification that comes with that. At Boca, the same thing. Although they don't have a school, they have several sports that they do partake in. And, of course, the social club itself ends up being a place where a lot of young people grow up in, a lot of families grow up in, a lot of individuals end up going. So you have that on one end, and then you have the football and political interests knocking at each other. And sometimes it's the latter that ends up beating on the former a little bit more, because at some point these clubs and the structures that they have need money. And where does it come from? From football. Where does football end up getting its strength? From business. So it's kind of a weird bedfellow that you end up finding on one side and on the other, that you need them both, especially in Argentina. But then what ends up being so weird is that the implementation of privatization comes at a time where the privatization of football ends up being the most important out of the least important things in terms of Argentina society, in terms of Argentina financially, socio-economically, and also from a social cultural standpoint, that you end up seeing a bit of a crossroads that the country is going through right now. Again, I don't want to get into a political facet or into a political facet of my conversation here, although when you deal with Argentina, you end up having to begrudgingly have to endeavor into that. When you deal with these situations, and again, I gave you a couple of examples, Racing being one of them, most recently Independiente, whose president, I guess president in name, and what he was able to say on a television interview just yesterday, of course, recording on a Thursday. Yesterday he goes and says, well, Independiente was going to go on a preseason, so much so that the team had to send out a statement saying that their preseason is totally canceled, that they have no preseason this year. They'll have training sessions, but there is no preseason with preseason games and scrimmages and things of that nature. But this is all caused because there was a private entity that came in and said, hey, you know what? We're going to give you no cost a preseason in Miami. And all of a sudden, the visas were made, a lot of these things were done, a lot of the diplomatic and transport issues were being worked upon, the visas were completed, and all of a sudden they start finding out that there's certain things that aren't working. So what does Independiente do? They send an envoy to Miami to go see if a hotel exists, when all you need to do is go on Google Maps, all you need to do is go online. They send an envoy to Miami to find out if there is such a hotel that exists. Kind of catch where I'm coming, right? You see where I'm getting with all of this. The entity, well, I think it's called Black and White Inc., ends up saying it's going to be all no expenses, and all of a sudden they're asking for money. They're asking for hundreds of thousands of dollars from Independiente, the team that's basically bankrupt, to fulfill the end in terms of buying the tickets to fly to South Florida. And when they find out, that ends up being a scam, because there's a lot of privatization that has gone on Independiente there. So there are several hands in that proverbial cookie jar trying to get something out of the club, trying to see what they can ask. Imagine this is an Independiente side that just had a campaign trying to raise funds, when all of a sudden the person that was running it was saying he's doing out of the kind of his heart, and then next thing you know, he's talking about getting a certain cut of the funds that were collected. He had promised somewhere around 20 million. He ended up only getting about 3. But it ends up being a very scandalous situation for a team like Independiente. You have to go also across the street to Racing, where the privatization of Racing in the late 90s going into the early 2000s ends up really rocking that institution to the core, where the most fundamental facets of Racing were kind of omitted, were kind of left aside, were kind of brushed aside for football. The problem with privatization in a lot of situations, and again, I'm not demonizing it, I'm just talking about how it's been managed in several parts of the world, because like I said, for every 1 or 2 examples, I could give you 20 that haven't worked out. In Racing's case, it was a team that was basically bankrupt. It was acquired by a private company, and it was run as a private company, and therefore a lot of things from the social club were omitted. When you see that going on, you end up being, there's a certain trauma, there's a certain negativity towards privatization when it comes to that, because they've seen how some clubs are run, and how some clubs are run into the ground as far as the work that has been done. Now, there are positive examples, such as Red Bull Bragantino, Independiente del Valle. There are good examples as well, and how they've been run and how those projects have been run and administered. But the problem is that those entities have closed establishments, and then there's already a plan in place. People that have set up the plan that are in place, they've been able to do that. So when you start bringing in people that are trying to get a buck, and that's been the problem, because when you deal with these types of contexts, you end up dealing with people that all they're looking to do is plunder. They're looking to sell a player, but there's no reinvestment into that money, if you will. It goes straight into my pocket, if you will. I go and I sell the player, the money comes to me, I put it in my pocket and don't reinvest it in the club. That's what's happened a lot of times at clubs in Argentina and various institutions as well that have been privatized in the past, in South America, I should say. There is no reinvestment. It's taking out the resource, selling the resource, and then pocketing the profits. That's basically what it's been. And the club never even sees it. So from that perspective, you end up having people run clubs into the ground, literally. And that's what ends up happening in a league, excuse me, where this is going on. And this could go on. That's why there is such resistance from a fan perspective of these private entities coming in to football. Again, I wish I could give you better news, but that's basically how things are being looked at from this side. We'll see how things go, and we'll see if they do change as time goes by.